Welcome to the Impactus Podcast. I'm Dean Brenton, and we are here to equip you as men for a life of purpose and godly impact. What if some of our Christian teachings have damaged our daughters and taught them to be small and invisible? What if some of the most common teaching girls here in the church today make them more likely to marry an abuser, less likely to understand consent, and more likely to blame themselves if they're assaulted? Well, armed with data from an all-new survey of more than 7,000 women, the authors of The Great Sex Rescue, Sheila Wray Gregoire, her daughter Rebecca Gregoire, Lindenbach, and Joanna Sawatsky, reveal how experiences in the church as teens affect women's self-esteem and relationships today in their brand new book, She Deserves Better, Raising Girls to Resist Toxic Teachings on Sex, Self, and Speaking Up. They go on to expose common evangelical teachings that can backfire, the purity emphasis that can cause shame rather than good choices, the dating rules that can prime girls for abuse, and the belief that can keep them from setting healthy boundaries. Now, I'm a dad with 4 daughters, so this is a particular interest to me. And if you're a dad or hope to be a dad, today's conversation will be a helpful one for you, maybe a little hard to hear. If you're a dad of daughters, it'll be particularly relevant, but if you're a dad with sons, don't tune out. This topic is going to be important for you too. And a little disclaimer, this conversation gets into some sensitive topics, so if the little ones are around or if you're listening on the drive to school, just be warned. So I'm really delighted today to have Sheila Gregoire joining us. She is the face behind BearMarriage.com, the largest single blogger marriage blog. She's also an award-winning author of 9 books, a very sought-after speaker. She's got a humorous, no-nonsense approach, and she's passionate about changing the evangelical conversation about sex and marriage to line up with kingdom principles. She lives in Ontario, Canada with her husband, and they have 2 adult daughters and 2 grandbabies. You know, it is a privilege to be able to bring you solid, biblical, and practical content through these podcasts. If you know of a young guy in particular, who could use this kind of resource, invite them to check out our Young Guys podcast, our Young Men's podcast as well. We would be grateful if you would also subscribe and share our podcast and leave us a review on the platform you use, not just for our benefit, but to get more people to experience this content. And lastly, if you would like to support the work of our ministry at Impactus and these kinds of podcasts, please head over to impactus.org/give and consider becoming a monthly partner or making a one-time donation to help us continue this vision to see every man become, grow, and live as a disciple of Jesus. So with no further ado, let's get into today's episode. Well, welcome to the Impactus Podcast. Sheila, thank you for joining us today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's such a delight. And I just learning some new information that you used to actually be a contributor for us. So that's fantastic.
I did. I wrote a column in 7 magazine for quite a while. Yeah.
That is so cool. We need to get you back as a columnist again. You tell us a little bit about yourself and for people maybe that are not familiar with you and your family and your current work.
Sure. So I've been married for, I think it's 31 years. We have 2 adult daughters. Belleville, Ontario is where we call home. Both my daughters are married and I have 2 lovely grandbabies, which is amazing.
Ooh, nice.
And when the girls were younger, we homeschooled. I started blogging. So I was in the mommy blogging space for quite a while. And the more I talked about sex, the more my traffic grew. And so I kind of became like this Christian sex lady and did that for quite a few years. And then in the last few years, everything has really changed for me because I did something that I hadn't done before, which was I started reading some of the other evangelical marriage books. And when I did, I was really concerned with how they talked about sex. I thought, I know Jesus, they know Jesus, we all must be saying the same thing. But that wasn't necessarily true. So now we are on a big mission of research. So we started with our book, The Great Sex Rescue, interviewed and surveyed 20,000 women to find out if there are certain teachings that are prominent in the evangelical church, not from Jesus, but just prominent in the church, that actually end up hurting women's marital and sexual satisfaction. And then we followed that up with this book, looking at women's experiences as teen girls.
I love the research. I just love this whole area and such a needed conversation. So we're going to dive into that today. So your newest book, which just released, She Deserves Better. Now, dad of 4 here. So, dad of 4 daughters here. And so this really resonated for me as I read through the book. I'm like, oh, I wish I had this 20 years ago. Like this would have been so good. Because I'm actually a product of that evangelical culture and some of those writings and some of those books. And the more I read your research, I'm like, oh my goodness, like this is really profound and really needed for us to wrestle with this again. So yeah, your new book, She Deserves Better, is really, I guess it was written for mothers and daughters, but it's not limited to that. So why did you feel so important? This was such an important message. And what was kind of the inspiration for writing this book?
Well, after we wrote The Great Sex Rescue, we had so many women. And if you're listening to this podcast, just go on Amazon, type in Great Sex Rescue and look at the reviews. There's over 2,000 of them. And wow. As you read them over and over again, what you hear is, I felt so validated. I felt so seen. I felt so heard. So it really did set women and men free. But then after that came out, I had all these women saying to me, okay, I feel better now, but now I have absolutely no idea what to do with my kids. Because I don't want to teach them the same toxic stuff I grew up with, but I also don't want to say to my 14-year-old, go do whatever you want, go out into the world. Like that's not what we want either. And so how do you find something that's healthy? And we were trying to answer that question because a lot of the messages that were given to adult women, they were even worse when given to teens. And so that's what we were looking at.
I love that. So you alluded to the messaging that a lot of the evangelical church and curriculum and books have written about. So how have they created those landmines for girls, especially when it comes to things like self-esteem, consent, navigating relationships? Like what are some of those messaging that have been so difficult for females in particular?
Okay, well, let me tell you a story. And as Canadians, we can all relate to this. Okay, so, I grew up very mainstream evangelical in the 80s in Toronto. And I remember my youth group days were filled with like, how do you share your testimony at school? How do we start a Christian group on campus? Let's pray through Operation World. And we're concerned with the 1040 window. And yeah, you're nodding. So that's kind of your youth group experience too, right? Yeah. Like it was all about evangelism and testimonies and everything. And it was great. And we really were wrestling with how to pray and all this stuff. And I think for many of us who are Gen X, we don't realize how much that changed for the next generation. And what we found in our survey, 7,000 women, we were able to look at different generations. And when the millennials got to be teenagers, what they went through in youth group was so fundamentally different from us. Because for millennials, faith had changed. And it was no longer primarily about sharing your testimony, primarily about evangelism or prayer. It was really about don't have sex till you're married. You need to be a virgin. And even though that we believe that too, that wasn't the focus of our faith. But for millennials, the focus of their faith, especially for girls, was you must be a virgin on your wedding night. And that's really all it was. Like, it was incredible when you look through the resources that were written for millennial girls. They were all about virginity and purity. And purity defined in a very strange way. And while, hey, I think it's great to have your kids wait for marriage, to have sex, like no problem. I think that's what we all should be aiming for if we can. But we live in a Jesus gospel, which says that when you are in Christ, you are a new creation, and we are not defined by what we do with our bodies. We are defined by what Jesus did with his. And we raised a generation to feel like they bore so much shame if they made a mistake, or even worse, if something was done to them. They were now damaged goods. Mm. And the messaging around virginity impacted how we talked about modesty, how we talked about consent, how girls felt about their self-esteem. And when you measure the long-term effects of youth group, it is so much worse for millennials. And many of those older millennials are today raising kids. And they don't want to do the same thing that was done to them, but they're not sure what to do instead.
Wow. It's so much flashback because I'm a product of of that very culture, youth pastor back in those years. And I can just hear those themes and some of those subliminal messages almost at times, in some of the things that were very evident in the culture around us, the church culture around us. Mm-hmm. It was even evidenced in some of the books like I Kiss Dating Goodbye and mm-hmm. things like that. And some of the dating rules of the 90s and the 2000s. Like, what would you say is a better way now for, to teach the next generation dating rules, as it were, but a better to navigate relationships today?
Yeah. Okay. So let me give you data, because I'm all about data. All right.
Love it. Bring it.
So here's what happened. People often forget that the 80s were really bad for teens. So we think that things are always getting worse. They're actually not. For those who were teenagers in the 80s, we were more likely to have had sex. Teen pregnancy rates were really high. Alcohol, drug use was really high. Today, all of those things are lower. Now, porn use is higher, mental health is worse, and oral sex is higher. But so it's not all great. But it's not like the 80s were this wonderful thing and it's gotten worse. No, it was really bad. And so parents were reacting against that. And they were saying, I don't want that for my kids. I want to save my kids that heartache. I don't want my kids having sex with everybody. So what are we going to do? And the church as a whole decided that they were going to do this thing called purity culture, which is where like the I Kiss Dating Goodbye came in. So not only is sex bad, dating is bad. And so is kissing. No one can kiss before they're married, which no one's ever done before, by the way. Like, you go back to Jane Austen, they were all kissing as soon as they were engaged. Like, this is not a thing waiting for you're married, but it became a thing, during purity culture. So what we did was we looked at girls and we divided them into 4 camps, whether they were allowed to date or not, and whether they did date or not. So you might have been allowed to date and didn't date, not allowed to date and didn't date, and not allowed to date, but you dated anyway, right? So there's your 4 camps. Here's the thing though. How do you tell who did the best? Because during purity culture, there was really only one measure that mattered, and that was, did they save sex for marriage? But what if we look at other measures? What if we also ask, what was their future marital and sexual satisfaction like when they did get married? What's their self-esteem like? Because self-esteem is related to mental health, your ability to keep a job, what kind of job you have, your relationship quality. It's related to everything. What if we look at your whether or not you got married if you wanted to get married, right? Because nothing wrong with being single. Okay, Paul says that's the best. But if you did want to get married and you didn't get married, that's something to mourn, right? Or what if you look at marrying an abuser? And so if we take all of those outcome variables and we look at those 4 things, I have some bad news. There isn't an option that lets you get the best in every category. There isn't an option. And I think this is really key for parents to understand, is there isn't a rule that always works. Purity culture was looking for a rule. There isn't a rule that always works. I'll tell you the one that does the best, because, okay, there is one that does the best. And that's being allowed to date, but choosing not to. And you know what, parents? You can't control that.
So true. So true.
You can't control that. So the girls who did the best were those who were allowed to date, but they're looking around, they're saying, you know what? I am super busy with sports or with drama or with my part-time jobs. And I am working hard at school to get into university. And I'm just not interested in these guys around me right now. Those are the girls who did the best.
That's fascinating. You just mentioned one of the outcome variables that you measured in your survey, that was the likelihood that a girl would marry an abuser. Now that's a scary, difficult topic, but what red flags did you find in your research?
Yeah, so anything that, first of all, causes self-esteem to plummet. So as soon as we cause self-esteem to plummet, then your likelihood of marrying an abuser goes way up. Here's one of the biggest ones. And guys, I'm glad I'm talking to men, because I really want you to hear this one, okay? When girls feel a lot of shame around their periods. That is a huge thing. It doesn't seem like that would be related to it, but when you feel a lot of shame around your period, it often means you have low self-esteem in other areas too. So the more that as dads, you can just make this matter of fact. It doesn't need to be a big deal. I'm not saying that you should like celebrate every time your kid has a period or talk about it, but it's just not like a big deal that she shouldn't have to hide her pads or her tampons. You know, she should be able to say she's crampy and you go get her a Tylenol or an Advil, you know? But the more this just becomes normal, it's not something to be ashamed of. And teaching teenage boys about what's going on with their sisters too is so key, because she's just got a body. That's how God made her. And the more that she can feel like there's not something wrong with my body and I don't need to make myself small or ashamed. Yeah. So that's a big one. Other ones are anytime she believes that boys are kind of hopeless. And we teach this a lot. The idea, for instance, that boys can't help but lust if you're dressed like you're trying to entice it, or a boy has such a hard time stopping in a makeout situation, and so she is responsible for stopping the sexual progression. So anytime we make it sound like boys have this out of control sexuality, and so she is responsible for stopping him from sinning, which we do a lot, she's way more likely to marry an abuser. And it makes sense, because if you tell her that all boys are going to treat her badly, then when one does treat her badly, she will not see that as a red flag. She will just assume that's what all guys are like.
Wow. It really resonates, because you know, that message has been very prominent for guys as well. And it's not only just the messaging that has damaged girls, but it's damaged guys because they have such a low view of themselves. And I have no control. I can't. And it's so false. It's just not true. And I love that you're pushing that reality and truth along. So I'm hearing in my head, you know, some people are probably listening going, but Sheila, if you swing the pendulum so far one way, like, you know, are we just going to lose the generation on the other side? But where should the pendulum kind of land so that there's a healthy understanding about how we teach sex and relationships to the next generation?
It needs to come from an understanding, first of all, that everybody is responsible for their own sin.
That's good.
She cannot cause you to sin. And in the church, we have so made girls, even very young girls, responsible for men's sin. I remember when my daughter, my youngest was 11, her Sunday school teacher kept her behind and told her that she was going to have to start watching what shirts she wore now that her chest was developing, because she might become a stumbling block to the men at church. She was 11. And I couldn't get her to go to church for a couple of weeks. She was so absolutely grossed out that these adult men would be looking at her that way. And if you talk to any Christian woman, chances are she has a story like that. You know, when my girls were teenagers and they were on praise team, they were told by an elder's wife in the church that they couldn't wear skirts while on the platform in case the men in the front row looked up those skirts. Except the only men who ever sat in the front row were the elders serving communion. So, you know, and my girls were young teenagers. This is what we've done to our girls. What we've done to our boys, I think, and we talk about this more in another book based on a survey we did of men. Our book is The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex. And we looked specifically at the issue of lust. And what we found is that a lot of guys think they're lusting when they're not. What's really happening is they're just simply noticing a woman is attractive. And that's not lust. You know, Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman with lust. So looking is a deliberate action. Noticing, seeing, those are not deliberate actions. That's just living. That's existing. You're allowed to exist and live. Okay. So whoever looks at a woman with lust. So deliberate action combined with the deliberate mindset with lust. If you are noticing a woman is attractive, even if you notice she has like a good chest, or you notice her butt or whatever, and then you just go on with your day, that is not lust. But we have so conflated noticing with lusting that a lot of men feel like they are sinning just by existing. And that creates this impossible, untenable situation for them. And so their only solution is to get women to cover up. But when you tell women to cover up because men can't help it. Let me tell you the results. So when girls believe, for instance, that boys are visual in a way that girls will never understand, which research has now disproven that, but anyway, or that boys can't help but lust, she is now 68% more likely to marry an abuser. She's 52% more likely to experience vaginismus or a sexual pain disorder when she's married. And evangelical women suffer from that at about 2 to 2.5 times the rate of the general population. And it makes sex very, very painful, if not impossible. A lot of women can't even insert tampons. Best course of treatment for those listening is to go to a pelvic floor physiotherapist and read our book, The Great Sex Rescue. But this is a really debilitating problem that so many women have. So 52% more likely to have that, and 30% more likely to have low self-esteem. And there's no need to talk about it that way. We can, and in She Deserves Better, we walk you through how to have a conversation with your daughter about clothing choices, where we focus on what the Bible focuses on, which is not flaunting wealth. We talk about how to dress in ways that are appropriate for the occasion, how to dress in such a way that you respect yourself and others, but we're not going to talk about it in terms of causing someone else to sin or in making men out to be dangerous and hopeless.
That's so good. I really appreciated that about the book. There were so many practical applications and conversations that just naturally lead in that you could have with your daughter and as a family and as parents. You touched on something here that the modesty rules actually go even beyond, though, to almost encourage predatory behavior with guys and not just teen boys, but even adult men. Talk about that a little more.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me tell you the worst thing that we read when we were doing our research. There was a curriculum. I actually bought it to do with my girls, called Secret Keeper Girl. And it was really popular for girls sort of ages 8 to 12. And there were exercises for moms to do with their kids. And in one of them, there was a lot of clothing modesty tests. And one of the rules was raise and praise. So you had to be able to raise your hands. And if any belly showed, that was bad. And the author, Dana Gresh, explained that bellies are intoxicating. And then she had a conversation that moms were supposed to work through with their daughters about what this meant. So intoxicating means that men are out of control, like when they're drunk. And God created your body to be intoxicating to men, but you're only supposed to be intoxicating to your future husband. And so you want to cover up, and so you don't inadvertently intoxicate someone and then defraud them. Now, let's break down what she said. She told 8-year-olds that their belly could cause adult men to get out of control.
Wow.
Exactly. Wow. How did nobody see this? How did that Secret Keeper Girl, she had conferences all across Canada. This curriculum sold like wildfire. For 15 years, I think she was doing this. Like, how did nobody say, you know what? Let's not tell 8-year-olds that their bodies make adult men get out of control. But that is what we largely did. And then you combine that with the message that, men can't stop, boys can't stop when they get excited and when they get turned on. And suddenly girls are now feeling responsible when they are the ones who are assaulted. And that has so terrible repercussions, especially when we've now told girls that if they're not virgins, then God doesn't love them as much and they're damaged goods. Wow.
Horrible message both ways. The shame and the pressure to put on girls to have to handle that kind of messaging, and guys just reinforcing a false narrative that there's nothing you can do. It's just your nature. You're just going to be out of control. You'll be intoxicated. And it's, So here's an opportunity. Speak to the guys out there who bought into that purity culture message that lusting is inevitable, that you can't help yourself. And really it's the woman's responsibility.
Nowhere in scripture does it say that. Absolutely nowhere. And in fact, when it talks about modesty in scripture, it's not even talking about the clothing that you're wearing in terms of sexual attraction. It's talking about not flaunting wealth. Everywhere where Jesus talks about lust, he puts the responsibility on the person lusting, not on the object of that lust. And self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. And women do not have the Holy Spirit more than men do. Lust is never talked about as a special sin that men can never get over, or that will always be a battle that you have to fight. It just isn't. But the way that we often talk about how to defeat lust doesn't work, because we're still dealing with the same underlying problem, which is we're viewing women as objects. So if your way of defeating lust is simply to bounce your eyes, avoiding looking at women, avoiding ever being with women, that's not what Jesus did. Do you know the longest conversation that we have recorded of Jesus's was with a woman by himself, with a Samaritan woman? Jesus never refused to look at women. Jesus chose to truly see women. And that is the difference. If we want to defeat lust, it's not about not noticing her body. It's about choosing to see who she is and treating women as whole people. And then, of course, again, just realizing that noticing is not lusting. And we have put such a lot of shame on a lot of men for things that they weren't even doing in the first place.
As you're talking, my mind is flashing back to some of the popular evangelical books for men around this topic. It's every man's battle. There is, it's inevitable. Yes. There's no way out. And it's such a distorted narrative, so far from the truth of Scripture, like you said. Tell us ways that, because you allude to this in the book, that different ways that girls are taught to make themselves small so that boys can feel big.
Yeah. So one of the popular sayings that we found in a lot of literature to teen girls, and we still hear it, is this idea that girls talk too much. Did you ever hear that women say more words than men?
I've heard that. Oh, yeah.
Yes. We used to teach that at marriage conferences. It was part of our curriculum, and it was based on something that James Dobson first taught, I think in 1983 in his book, Love for a Lifetime, that women say 25,000 words a day to men's 12,000 or whatever. And then Gary Smalley repeated it. I think the numbers changed to 50,000 and 25,000. And some people would say 14,000 and 7,000. The numbers were always different, but the idea was always the same, that women say roughly twice the number of words a day than men. Well, this got passed along enough that scientists actually looked at it. And so they would hook up recorders to both men and women, and they would count the number of words they said in a day. And guess what? Men and women say roughly the same number of words on average. There is no statistical difference. But we have been told that women talk too much. And in Brio magazine, put out by Focus on the Family, they had so many articles to teen girls saying boys don't like girls who talk a lot. You need to not talk. Shanti Feldon's book for young women only told girls that girls talk too much. So we measured it. We asked women, hey, when you were a teenager, did you believe that girls talk too much? And do you believe girls talk too much now? And when women believed that girls talk too much, they, again, more likely to marry an abuser, their self-esteem went down, all kinds of really negative effects. And it's not even true. In fact, when you put men and women in a mixed group, so there's both men and women present, the only time that women talk as much as men is when there's at least 80% women. When there's anything less than that, men are going to talk way more than their share, and women will talk way less. So it's not that women talk too much. It's that they don't speak up enough. And our daughters need our permission, especially their dad's permission, to speak and to disagree, to know that their voice and their opinions matter. Because dads, please hear me on this. If your daughter can't disagree with you, how will she ever be able to disagree with her husband?
Wow.
If you want her to be able to stand up to her husband, she needs to be able to stand up and tell truth to you.
That's good. That's so good. I've heard that same messaging about, the number of words spoken in sermons and at conferences. And wow, like that is fascinating. So the book is kind of written, from a mother's to daughter's perspective, but you've got a wonderful opportunity again, just to speak to the dads out there, maybe single dads who are raising daughters as well. But what practical advice would you give to dads or parents in general about having or starting these really important conversations with their daughters?
Well, let me give you two pieces of good news. Okay. So the first piece of good news is that church attendance is really good. right? Church attendance, believing in Jesus, they all work out well for girls in the end. They'll be more likely to have high marriage satisfaction, sexual satisfaction, high self-esteem, just better off in general. But there's a piece of bad news that goes along with it, which is as soon as girls start internalizing a lot of the toxic messages around consent or modesty, then the effects of church disappear. Wow. The good effects of church disappear. And in many cases, they would actually be better if they hadn't gone to church at all. So the kind of church you go to actually matters, and what is being taught in your youth group matters. So get involved. Find out what your girls are going to be hearing and your boys are going to be hearing at youth group. Youth group is often separated from the larger church, and you may think you go to a great church, but you don't know what's going on in youth group or what's being taught. They focus so much on sex, way more than they do in adult church, and it can get very distorted. So find out what's being taught. The other piece of news that I would want people to know is that more information, there is no downside. Like there's talking to your kids, always a good thing. So the more sex ed they knew, the more they knew about consent and date rape and all of that, the better they did long term. So often we're scared to talk to our kids about stuff, or we're scared to talk about it too early because we don't want them to do it. We think as soon as they know what masturbation is, they're going to start masturbating. If they know what sex is, they're going to start having it. Not true. The more they know about sex ed, the less likely they are to do some of these things we don't want them to do, and the more likely they are to have really super high self-esteem. So talk to your kids, and you don't need to do it perfectly. I did it so badly. Oh my gosh, I did it so badly when I was telling them about puberty and everything. But because we had a good relationship and we kept talking, it didn't matter because they could still come to me later on. So you don't have to do things perfectly, but you do have to talk to them, even if it's awkward.
That's so good. Let me just nuance the question just a little bit, but what would you say to the dad or parents who are raising sons about proper understanding or thinking, communicating about how to treat the girls around them?
I think the respect message is so important, that we see girls not as threats, and that girls are not there to boost your ego. Girls don't owe you anything. They are just people just like you are. And that shows in how the difference between the way we treat our boys and our girls. Does your boy do less housework than you require your girl to do? Does he get to sit down while she is setting the table? Right? Like how are you changing things between your boys and your girls? Make sure that you're not relying on your daughter for more than you rely on your son when it comes to maybe even looking after younger siblings. Because when we do these things, we tell boys, you are more important than she is. Your time is more important and more valuable. And so you get to relax more than she does. That's going to carry on to how he treats women, what he thinks he's entitled to. And that's going to lead to bad marriages and bad things later on.
That's so helpful. You did allude to for parents, the importance of parents to be aware of what their kids are being taught in church or school, or if a parent finds themselves in a setting where some of these messages are coming through, what can they do as parents to mitigate against that?
I would talk to the leaders, because sometimes leaders just have never heard anything else. Share the findings. There's lots of charts, and She Deserves Better. You can photocopy a chart. You have my permission, photocopy a chart, hand them the book and just say, hey, when we teach girls this about modesty, when we teach boys this about modesty, here's what happens long term. And here's some other ways that we can talk about it. Because it could be that your youth pastor just doesn't know anything else, because that's all they've been taught, and they're just trying to do the best. And so I always recommend, go to the pastors first, go to the leaders first, because quite often people are quite receptive. They want to, they don't know what to say either. And so giving them a new resource that is freeing is a really good thing. Now, if they keep not listening to you, then you need to start thinking, is this a toxic place for my kid? And that's what we found. And you'll read story after story, and She Deserves Better, what happens when you do stay in a toxic place. Let me just, for example, Vera, whose story opens our consent chapter, she was a victim of date rape, couldn't put words to it, was very confused, very hurt, went to her youth pastor, and her youth pastor said, as soon as she told him, well, what did you expect dating a non-Christian? You don't want that kind of a youth pastor advising your kids. And so while sometimes people will listen to you, other times you need to realize, okay, this is not a good place for my kids.
That's so good. If you were to take all your research and kind of boil it down into one thing that you wanted to ensure parents considered a non-negotiable to raise a healthy daughter, what would you boil it down into?
Oh my goodness. I'm trying to think of something different from what I've already said. I honestly think the biggest thing is giving your daughter a voice, because if she's allowed to disagree with you, if you ask her for opinions on things, then she knows that she matters. And when women make themselves smaller, when they don't think that they're worth as much, that's when they're more likely to get into destructive relationships. Or even if it's not that, that's also when they're not necessarily going to run with the gifts that God's given them. They're not going to think they have anything to offer the world, and they're going to make themselves small. So even if they're not in a destructive relationship, you see how amazing this girl is that God gave you. You see how incredible she is and all the gifts that God has given her, even if she can't see it for herself. And you want her to thrive in those things. But she isn't going to thrive unless she feels like she has something to offer. So the more that you can say, your opinion matters. I want to listen to you. Especially if she's getting into her teenage years and beyond, then that's going to set her up for a lot of success.
I love that. What a great message that your daughters matter, and they need to know that they matter, and they do have a voice, and you give space for that. I think that is such an important, profound thought. This has been just a fascinating conversation, because there's lots of flashbacks in just my own history and just some of the messaging I've heard, but also as we've attempted to raise our own daughters and to encourage them that they do matter, their voice matters, that they are strong women, that they can make a difference in the world, and they don't have to be small. They can be as big as God has created them to be. And we need to be those, I think, those kinds of parents that just, let them know that they matter and not let anything else get in the way of that. You've done research now with over, 27,000 women?
Yeah, 32,000 in total, because we've surveyed a lot of men too.
Incredible.
So, yeah.
The research itself speaks volumes, and I would encourage you, the listeners that are listening today, get your hands on this book, because the research is eye-opening enough, but just how you've kind of unpack the messaging and how I think helpful it can be and practical it could be. You've done a masterful job at that. And I hope every parent gets a copy of this, gets into it, gets it in their church, in their youth group, whatever, because it's a conversation worth having. Sheila, before we let you go, where can people connect with you, and where can they get a copy of She Deserves Better?
Yeah, so She Deserves Better. Everywhere you can buy books, you will find it. But you can find it specifically at my website with more information, and I'm at baremarriage.com. So that's BARE, baremarriage.com. You'll find our books there, Great Sex Rescue, Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex, She Deserves Better is there, our puberty course is there, and of course our podcast, our Bare Marriage podcast. You can find links to that as well.
Last question. Will you come back again and have another conversation about some of these topics?
Absolutely. I would love to.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight just to meet you and get to know you and learn that you've been a contributor in the past. And thanks for contributing to us today and sharing such a valuable, important, critical message that just needs to be shouted from the rooftops today. Our girls matter. And it should matter to us. And so thank you, Sheila, for your work. Keep doing it. Keep proclaiming this. And we just applaud everything that you're doing for the kingdom. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thanks for listening to the Impactus Podcast. To learn more about living a life of purpose and godly impact, check out impactus.org.